once again to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this week, we watched Blade Runner 2049, the sequel that no one ever asked for, you didn't want, but now that it's here, I'm very happy about it. So Jackson, what did you think of this movie?
You know what? I liked it. For some context, I know that Blade Runner is a very revered film. I like that movie, but I've only seen it once. I'm not even sure which cut I saw because I saw it in a theater doing a replay. I'm pretty sure it was the final cut. But so I like the movie. It's not in my go-to stable of personal classics that I go back and rewatch over and over again. It's just a good most really good visual treats with some interesting themes to chew over. So it's not something I wasn't walking into 2049 with really any, I won't say with no expectations, just because I saw Arrival and I know that was by the same director, and I thought Arrival was for the most part quite good. I think now that I'm thinking about it again, my problems I have with both movies are a little similar in that I think that in some areas it leans a little on the schmaltzy side, which I'll kind of go into. But overall, I really liked Ryan Gosling's character a whole lot. I was sort of thinking about how it's kind of the reverse, in my opinion, of the original Blade Runner, where the main character, Deckard, Harrison Ford's character in that movie, I think is the least interesting character, and and it's all the stuff going around him that's sort of more engaging on a narrative level. Here it's sort of the opposite in that I think that Kay, our protagonist, is the most interesting character by far. Ryan Gosling gives a really good performance, and Ryan Gosling is always great. And it's the other characters around him that work or don't work to varying degrees for me. And some of them, the hologram, his hologram wife, Joy, I really like her. I like the henchman lady that is chasing them throughout. And yeah, there's a lot of great stuff in this movie. Despite maybe some little narrative quibbles I have, it was overall a good use of my time. Good movie.
Yeah, I am a little bit more invested in the Blade Runner universe than Jackson is. This is pretty much my dad's favorite movie, the original, that is. So I grew up seeing it. I can do most of Rutger Hauer's Tears in the Rain speech just from hearing him say it 10,000 times. I mean, that's nothing wrong with that. It's an absolutely fantastic speech. So I was a little bit more invested in this from the get-go. When they announced a sequel to Blade Runner, my initial impulse was absolute revulsion. I was very much expecting something schlocky, something that goes through and tries to answer the big questions of Blade Runner 1. I mean, there's some serious ambiguity in that movie that is totally intentional, and I could see in the wrong hands them running with that and just being like, we're gonna finally solve all of the questions that anyone had so that this science fiction classic will forever be tarred in the memory of anyone who sees the new movie, and everyone's gonna hate us for it. But instead, they gave this to a competent director. As Jackson was saying, they gave it to Denis Villeneuve, who did make Arrival, was really one of my favorite movies of last year, and when I saw it was him, I'm like, oh, all right, you know what? I trust him at this point. I was still a little hesitant, producer meddling and everything like that can really still fuck up a movie, but overall, I was incredibly happy with how it came out. It didn't mess with any of the core tenets. It didn't feel gratuitous. Nothing about it. It felt like an actual sequel to Blade Runner. Like if it had come out 2 or 3 years later. It was slow, it was methodical, it was incredibly paced. The visuals were very reminiscent of the original Blade Runner. The characters were all just cut and dry, and it did a wonderful job of upholding the original legacy, which is incredible in this age of Transformers and Pacific Rim 2 and everything else that basically screamed to me, you know, careful, this movie could absolutely suck. It could turn into a schlocky action fest that does away with the identity of the original in favor of solving the original, which didn't need solving. So basically, all my rambling aside, I'm incredibly happy with it. It was 100% worth it. It's definitely a little bit of a slower movie, so if you are going to go see it, be prepared for that. It's 2 hours, 40 minutes long, but if you know what you're in for, if you're a fan of the original, it's going to feel like an hour, unless you have to pee about halfway through, whereas then it starts to feel long again, because then you just start to ache all over, and it's about 20 minutes till the end, and you're just watching your watch because you got to go take a pee.
Oh, that's the worst situation to be in. Yeah, regarding the length, I have seen people complaining about the length, and it's like, A, like, what are you doing? Did you know what movie you were walking into? And B, it didn't even feel as long as, like, It. Like, It was, like, a 2-hour long movie that, like, felt much more stretched out than this did. Like, yeah, there's some shots of Ryan Gosling in a hallway, but there's really, like, only one scene that I can think of that, like, I thought was just, like, unnecessary and, like, the movie could have done, like, better without it. Like, not to say that, like, I thought it was, like, a perfect movie otherwise, but just, like, the narrative as presented, there was only one time where I felt like the movie would be, like, dragging, and ironically, it was in one of the more, like, exciting scenes that would be, like a spoiler. So, yeah, the length, I don't know what the fuck people are talking about. It felt like everything, because that's the thing about length. It's not about how long the movie actually is. It's about, like, if the movie is using its time wisely. And this movie is using its time to, like, build mood and atmosphere and, like, establish characters and, like,
establish the world.
Yeah, the world, lots of sweeping shots, and really beautiful visuals that just, like, so it's another, like, eye feast. So it, as opposed to something like It, where it's the same jump scare, like, 30 times. So despite being an hour shorter, like, I'm ready to leave It more than I am ready to leave Blade Runner. I think people don't fucking get, like, what it is when a movie feels too long.
Yeah, they just look at that running time and call it, oh, that was so long. I mean, yeah, you have to set aside a day, and it ended up, I went immediately after work one day and didn't get home till 7 o'clock at night, and I left at 7 in the morning, so it was a long fucking day, but it honestly, the movie itself didn't feel long. I loved every second of it, and I left like, oh my god, it's 7 o'clock, but not resenting that fact, actually embracing it, because I loved that 2 hours 40 so minutes in this theater. I thought it was absolutely incredible. So despite the fact that it was a incredibly quote unquote long movie, especially for, I mean, today's day and age, barring Transformers, which I guess kind of goes against what I'm saying, but whatever, we're gonna roll with it. It didn't feel like it was. It generally was an incredible movie, and it did not feel like it took up nearly as much time as it says it did. With that, though, I think we are going to kind of jump into spoiler territory. We are probably going to end up touching a little bit on Blade Runner 1 spoilers, just because we kind of have to. It's going to be right in the beginning. We're going to do our best to keep it as on the level as we can. But if you haven't seen Blade Runner 1, spoilers, I guess. Otherwise, welcome to the show.
It's been 30 years! You've had time!
Just a quick rundown. Blade Runner 2 follows the exploits of K, a replicant, and this is not the ambiguity of the first one. He is a replicant, and essentially his journey of self-discovery and finding out whether or not he is the child of a replicant, because that's kind of the big twist to this one. It's not that Harrison Ford can live longer and he's a replicant. It is, in fact, that replicants can have children, specifically certain replicants, which, I mean, obviously is a big deal in the Blade Runner universe. So the big thing I think that really kind of jumps out to both of us, but I know especially to Jackson, is the inclusion of Harrison Ford yet again, which I know is not really a surprise given the trailers, but kind of was supposed to be.
One of the big concerns I remember people having when I was talking with them about this movie was whether or not Harrison Ford was going to ruin this movie. And I mean that both in like a script sense and also a acting sense. Because Harrison Ford, as he has gotten older, and I certainly don't blame the man, but it seems like he's been giving less and less of a shit as of recent. I know that in Ender's Game, for example, he showed up and basically just like stared at the camera, kind of bored, like clearly not wanting to be there. To his credit, he did actually like muster up a little bit of enthusiasm for Force Awakens.
And to his credit, I don't remember Ender's Game. I forgot that came out until you just said it.
Well, I mean, he was a forgettable part in a forgettable movie. So we were, worried about him just kind of being like, grumpy grandpa, and also just, as you said earlier, whether or not the movie's going to be like the true story of Deckard, the replicant, like, and the movie wasn't that.
Thank God.
Thank God. I do wonder, one of the small niggling criticisms that I had throughout this movie was that it felt a little Star Wars-y at times, and I think a lot of that has to do with Harrison Ford, and I should probably explain what I mean by that.
It means that he reprised his role as Han.
I mean, he did the same kind of, it was very similar, the same, like, grumpy grandpa, like, shtick. But, no, it felt more Star Wars-y. The character I was thinking more about was Luke in The Force Awakens, and how he's sort of gone for most of it, and he's basically the central MacGuffin in the movie. But in Star Wars, Star Wars often gets this criticism that I had never so much been behind, because I feel like it's misunderstanding the point of the movies a little bit, and that it focuses too much on the Skywalker family, and then it makes the universe feel small. Except that the Star Wars story, like, ever since Empire, has pretty clearly been, like, a family saga. And it's about, like, space wizards and stuff, and Luke Skywalker is, like, the big hero who saved the universe, like, redeemed Darth Vader and led to the defeat of the Emperor, like, all this stuff. And, he's a big figure, he's like a mythological figure almost, and that making him this kind of MacGuffin in this space opera makes some kind of sense. But here, when we find out that the central MacGuffin, so to speak, is Deckard's child, and therefore Deckard himself is very important, it feels a little too neat to me. This story takes place, like, however many years, 30 years later, 40, whatever.
30-some.
Yeah, 30-some. And so it's strange to me that this broad story that you could really apply to any facet of, like, the Blade Runner universe, of this issue of replicants getting pregnant and a replicant, like, dealing with that potentiality that he was natural born and what that means. It feels like that's a broad enough story with enough ideas that we don't have to tie it back into the first one, because the events of the first one, they didn't feel very, like, world changing. It felt very small in scope, very noir. Deckard himself was just kind of a cop. Like I said earlier, I think he's the least interesting character in the movie, like, certainly less interesting than the replicants that he's hunting. And so it feels strange to bring him back, and I know that on some level, like, people want to see Harrison Ford come back because it's like a sequel to Blade Runner. How can you not have him? And on some level, I get that, but it also feels like by having him around, it's pulling the movie in too close, especially when in a lot of other ways the movie's trying to go bigger, like taking you outside the typical, like, Blade Runner city that we've seen, incorporating Vegas and all these other different, like, locales. But here we are, the plot is still focused on the events of the original that were sort of smaller scale, it felt like. And I guess I'm a little hung up on it because part of that smallness is, I think, what gives the original a lot of weight. I mean, it's the whole thing about, like, getting lost like tears in rain. Like, that's the whole point of the speech, right? Like, it's fleeting. Life is fleeting, not just in terms of, like, time, but in the terms of, like, the grand scheme of things. And so it's strange that we're making this mythology out of this character who, like, the most interesting thing about him was whether or not he was a replicant, and that's not something the movie is, like, just sort of leaves the possibility up there. It's not, like, something that's super duper, like, thoroughly explored. And B, just that we're doing this zooming in while also trying to, like, pull out. I don't know. It's something that kept bugging me, I guess.
Yeah, so I mean, the central question that is important to ask then is, should Deckard be alive for this? Does it really matter? Because I always got from the original was that Deckard was a very self-contained small story, and it should stay that way. And more so than that, I would never have pegged him to live 30 years down the line, replicant or not. He looked, old and beleaguered at that point. To be alive years later just felt kind of surprising to me. And I don't let my criticisms fool you. I think this is an absolutely fantastic movie. But I want to agree with Jackson in that his appearance rings hollow in some ways. It just kind of felt like a necessary cameo that I don't fully understand. It's almost one of those things where if Ryan Gosling wasn't in the lead, I would say it was there to sell the movie, but it's Ryan Gosling. I mean, that's a pretty big get. So I'm not entirely sure what their decision was to have Deckard come back. I mean, even if they had done a little allusion to him earlier on, like there was a reference to Rachel, his replicant pseudo wife, who is the one who ends up giving birth to a child, in some archives. And I thought that was, like, I've seen the trailer, so I knew it wasn't going to be all it was, but had it just been a little reference to her voice line or whatever, I thought that would have been really cool and really clever. Even if they wanted to make her the mother, that would make sense in universe, because it was Tyrell Corporation, who she was, directly created for. So to have her be special in some way 100% made sense. And so when she didn't show up in the movie, barring like one point, but we're not really going to discuss that, I like that she was a footnote to this new series, not the central role that she was in the original. And it felt much more natural.
It felt like a good way to incorporate that plot without feeling too... It still felt a little bit neat to me, but I think if it had just been, like you said, kind of this footnote, and we get the audio recording, and that was sort of all, I think it would have jumped out a lot less, whereas with Harrison Ford, the entire finale basically is centered around him. And the last third of the movie is dealing with this issue of hunting him down and asking him whatever, or killing him so the future can stay bright and they don't find the child. Yeah. I don't know. It feels almost like, I don't know if we needed confirmation either way about where he was. I mean, I guess if you are going to bring Rachel back, it would make sense to mention him in some way. But so if we are going to have Rachel be the mother, then maybe... I want to say maybe it'd be more interesting if we just started off like he was dead or he didn't matter or whatever, but then just like on a plotting level in terms of like the finale, I mean, I guess you could have conjured up some like excuse for like why they had to protect for who Ryan Gosling had to kill to protect the identity of that child. It almost feels like they wanted that last decision to have more weight to us as an audience because, you know, we know Deckard as a returning character. Like, we wouldn't have felt the pressure of, you know, having to kill in order to serve this greater cause. If they were afraid maybe like your standard audience member wouldn't resonate with them as much if it wasn't Deckard.
If you haven't seen the original movie, and I have to imagine this is going to be a small number of people who haven't seen the original and went to see this, and you're listening to this, get in contact with me. I'm actually very curious now. How did you feel about Deckard's appearance? Like, did it feel weird? Did it feel, you know, natural? I mean, I'm just curious if you had any emotional investment to him, or if you're just expected to have the emotional investment from seeing the first one. Like, this is not a movie that you really needed to see the first one to get, but they included this character that you 100% needed to. I'm curious to see from someone who might not have seen this first movie whether, you know, you thought his character made sense in this one. I think that would be an interesting thing to know. But as I said, if you're watching this, you've probably seen the first one.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, though, because the smart thing that they did as far as emotional investment with Deckard is that they didn't put all their chips just into the nostalgia basket. They also, when you first meet him, it's under the assumption that he is actually Ryan Gosling's father. And so the big reveal, like, that's obviously supposed to be dramatic for the audience on the meta level, of like, oh my god, it's Harrison Ford. Look at him. That's obviously like the intended effect, but it also just has like the general side effect of being the reveal of Ryan Gosling meets who he thinks is his father. Of course, he doesn't turn out to be his father, which I think is a great... I like that a lot. I like that a lot about Kay's character, Ryan Gosling, wrestling with this thought of being like a special boy versus coming to terms with, again, just being part of something greater. I like that.
It's the anti-Lego movie. No one's special.
It is the anti-Lego movie, and I think that's cool because so much of like mainstream film is, again, about being the special boy, about being the chosen one or whatever, and it helps make it feel a little less Star Wars. The other thing I was thinking about too that made me go like, I don't know if I'm into this so much is the plot line about them trying to find the daughter or hiding the daughter so they can reform society. That felt very very Hunger Games-y to me. Not so much like Blade Runner, because I kind of, when I think about Blade Runner, I think of something grimy and kind of dirty, and something not so much like, we're about like the revolution, and I know this movie's engaging with its own ideas, but something about that plot point didn't really land with me until we get that reveal that it's not him, and that contextualizes it for me in a way that makes it feel fresh as opposed to being just like, you know, the revolution, the first natural birth. I mean, it's like I saw Children of Men like a decade ago, guys. So I'm glad they didn't just do that.
I will say the one thing that I'm fairly confident about is that, like, there was... I know the director of this, or one of the writers, I don't remember, I was reading an article and I don't even remember what it was, so apologies to that author. But they were talking about how they wouldn't be opposed to making a third movie. I mean, they're probably not going to, given how poorly this one is done in the box office. Go see it. But I feel like just I trust, after seeing the first one and then this one, I trust the authors enough that what they'll end up doing is, because there's big swaths of major history that are kind of skipped over between these two unless you watch the shorts, which even then they're just little shorts that you don't need to watch. I kind of liked it not seeing the shorts. But what I'm getting at here is that if they were to make a third one, I don't think we'd see anything about this revolution. I think we'd see the world post-revolution. I think that's a really cool idea, and I would totally be about that. Because these are not action movies. These are movies focusing on a character and their development and changes and how the world impacts them. So I think it'd be cool to watch another movie following this that could be about a human in a replicant's world or something like that. I mean, that might be a little too on the nose, but it still could be cool. And I'm also purely on conjecture now and just gushing about things I want to see, which whatever, I'm happy. So, yeah, I think that'd be cool, and I don't think that they would focus on the big battle. I think they would really just skip ahead, which I totally respect.
No, that's a good point. I hadn't considered it from that angle. And I do appreciate kind of along those lines that even without that theoretical third movie that, again, I mean, we're probably not going to get, I like that this movie comes to a conclusion on its own and it feels like a complete thing. Like, I'm not going to be waiting for that third movie that is probably never going to happen now.
There was no stinger that teased Thanos coming. We're good.
To play with the humans is to court death. Brr. Yeah, something like that. I don't know why I just did that. Anyway. Has been beating a dead horse, we'll see you in the next one.
So, now that we've had our Marvel interlude, because we can't go an episode without referencing some sort of thing we disdain about that whole cinematic universe, despite a general appreciation for it.
It's so weird.
Yeah. Let's actually start talking about the movie itself and kind of dive into some of the more character deaths. And as always, we're going to start with the start. And this is another thing that we're actually going to kind of do some comparison between the original Blade Runner. This is in like the first 5 minutes, though. So, I mean, no heavy spoilers to Blade Runner. But I guess if you haven't seen it and you're worried about the first 5 minutes being spoiled, heads up. So I think there's just some really interesting comparisons and world building with this first guy who dies. In this movie, he goes by the name Sapper, and he is hunted down, and he's just a farmer. He is nothing special. He is no threat to anyone. There is no indication that he needs to be hunted down and killed outside of, it's the Blade Runner's job to hunt down and kill replicants. He obviously fights back. Sapper, that is, fights back. But overall, it's a non-violent thing. He's clearly just trying to live his own life, do his own peaceful thing. It doesn't feel like he's actively hurting anyone. In comparison, Blade Runner 1, the first death we see is actually that of a human at the hands of a replicant who is presumed killed shortly after. So that sets a totally different tone, that replicants are dangerous, that replicants are haywire and a threat to humanity on the whole. I don't think there's a whole lot really more to say about these comparisons. I just think it's a really interesting piece of world building that shows the wild changes between Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049 and just how replicants handle themselves, how they're perceived, how it works on Earth. Because in the first one, they are clearly supposed to be represented as dangerous and wild, and in this one, they're immediately opened up with a more docile, human-esque living condition. It essentially picks up, honestly, where the original Blade Runner leaves off, in the realization that replicants are essentially human and should be treated as such. It's, as I said, it's just something I really like. I think it's a really clever bit of filmmaking.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up. It wouldn't make much sense if we had started in such a similar situation as the first one. Again, this is one of the things I'm thankful the movie doesn't do is rely too much on the like callback, because I can see like an alternate version of this intro where it's sort of like the first one restaged, but kind of not really, just to be like a crowd pleaser for like people who remember the intro of the first one, and they're treating the world building with like some sort of respect and trying to maintain like not just continuity within itself, but continuity within like, all right, like we've established in the original Blade Runner that it's not just like they're not like Ultron or like a Terminator, like it's not supposed to be just like a robots on the loose, like they're bad, like hunt them down. If that's where we had started off, like we've learned that lesson already, basically as an audience. The original has done its work, so now we can kind of go forward and keep exploring some of those ideas without that sort of baggage. The movie just assumes you're smart enough to remember that the point of the original is not that replicants are bad.
Or if you haven't seen the original, it's a quick showing that we're essentially just slaughtering them. It's essentially a murder scene. And, I mean, that in and of itself works really well. Much like the first movie shows that they are viewed as dangerous, wild things, this one shows that we're killing them because it's what we do. We retired the Nexus 7s. They need to be exterminated. So we're going to take a big jump here because it is a long movie and it is a deliberate movie. And not a lot of people die for probably an hour and a half after that. At least no one worth really noting. Right up until Robin Wright's character, the police lieutenant, is killed by Love. Love is, for context, the replicant of Wallace. Wallace is essentially the new Tyrell Corporation. Like, literally, they just took it over and called it Wallace now. And she is his number one replicant. She goes out and does his dirty work, finds people, kills people, etc., etc. I would argue that there's nothing necessarily super earth-shattering about this scene. It does give a lot of information very explicitly, in that, like, here's proof that replicants can lie and that they don't need to follow orders. And that is written out plain as day within the scene. It's explicitly stated that I'm going to tell Wallace that you shot me, so I killed you, which is 100% a fabrication of the scene. More than anything, I think we just kind of want to say that this is a neat scene.
Yeah, and maybe not super related to death, but I also wanted to use this moment with this Love character, the Robo henchman. I'm glad that as far as our antagonists go, she gets a lot more screen time and attention than Wallace himself does. Because of course Wallace is played by Jared Leto, and it's absolutely the worst thing in the movie. I saw a friend of mine made an excellent tweet about how, in the original Blade Runner, there are about 100 different cuts. But for Blade Runner 2049, they're only going to need 2. The theatrical and the minus Leto cut. And I basically agree. I'm just going to use this as an excuse to shit on Jared Leto for a bit. Because I'm already, disinclined to like his presence in the movie just based on all the obnoxious method acting shit that keeps popping up in the film news or whatever. And then when I actually see his performance, it's really, really over the top and really out of place in this movie. It feels like he's trying to be like a Roy. Every single one of his lines of dialogue is basically the Tears and Rain speech, except with about a fifth of 1% of effectiveness. He just basically sits there and pontificates. I was even a little bit. His dialogue was so overwrought and nonsensical that I ended up being a little confused as to what his motivation was. I got it. I got that obviously he wanted the child, so he could make new replicants, but I didn't understand why. He said something about, oh, I need more replicants to give birth to more replicants because I can never make enough. But if you're a corrupt corporate executive, why would you want a product that can make more of itself without your permission? That seems the stupidest thing. And I mean, I only saw the movie once, so maybe after hearing his dialogue again, it would make more sense. But I just didn't understand him and didn't really care to. Fuck Jared Leto, basically.
Taking a hardline stance on that one.
It's funny because I didn't expect to feel so strongly about him in this movie. Like I when I saw he was in it, like I kind of groaned and rolled my eyes because like I know that he's like a legitimate actor that has been in like real films. But all
Suicide Squad.
Well, that's what I was about to say. But like obviously like the biggest thing in my mind now is like fucking Suicide Squad and all that like clowning around herder. All that stuff he did on the set with like the method acting, seeing these like carrying over to this movie with like his dumb like being blind by like wearing like special contacts or whatever, and just seeing him be like such a like wart on this movie is such a like obnoxious performance. Oh, like every time he was on screen, I wanted to punch him in the face.
I didn't hate him as much. I don't like Jared Leto either. He drives me insane, but he's forgettable, and I think that's the important thing. Is that
the nicest thing we can say about Jared Leto in this movie?
I will not remember his performance. I will remember this movie. I will like this movie. I will buy this movie when it comes out. I will not remember him, and I do not care. He was adequate. He served his purpose. If you don't have a flaming hatred for him, I don't think you're going to have any real overt reaction to him other than you're going to forget about him.
See, I might have to disagree because I think this movie, like, spawned a flaming hatred for Jared Leto and me. I don't think I felt this. I didn't feel this strongly about him before I walked in. So, have 50-50 chance. Like, you might walk out of this movie hating Jared Leto. Like, who knows?
Your mileage may vary. So, you just disclaimer, you might hate Jared Leto after this. Moving on from that, let's talk about the other very cool woman in this movie, which, thank God, this movie actually has some cool women. I don't know that necessarily passes, like, the Bechdel test or anything like that, but, like, there's actually some badass women, which is a major step up from the creepy pseudo-rape scene in the first one, which I'm not going to get into. It's a whole nother big to-do. Anyway, we're going to talk about the Hollow Waifu, or Joy, as she's called. She is, as I indicated, this kind of holographic woman. She eventually gets she's originally trapped within Kei's house. He is her husband, master. It's really hard to say. It's a weird relationship, and that's the point of it. But she eventually gets some more mobility after he gets this emanator that allows her to essentially live in his pocket. And she's allowed to move within probably like 15 feet of him, and she doesn't really interact with the world, but in as much as a hologram can. Her whole hollowness, and it does work on both the she's empty and she's a holographic image, really kind of creates this idea of, much like Replicants in the first movie, it's like poetry, it rhymes. There's the question of, is she alive enough to die? Which she does in this movie, if you want to call it that. It is heavily foreshadowed, and this is probably the part that neither of us like the most about her whole thing. And like, it's very there comes a time when you're just like, oh, okay, she's gonna die, and it's dumb, and so you just kind of, all the weight that she had in this moment is kind of gone. But she does die. She's crushed. Her emanator is crushed underfoot, and she no longer exists. However, because she is an AI, and I think this is the part that's interesting, we have to ask, is she warranted of a death, or does she die in the sense that a machine dies? And I think this is really what the first movie was going for with their idea on replicants being close to humans. However, this movie leaves her a lot more ambiguous. Like, there's no clear-cut, yes, she's human. It's much more of a, is this just her programming? And I think that's really interesting. I don't know whether she'd be considered a quote unquote human death in this scene. I think she showed a lot of the standard human responses, but there was also some kind of oddities to her that I think kind of still keeps her at the AI level. So it's hard to say, especially because she is an AI. She's a standard model, and she's essentially Siri, and she can show up in any area in anyone's device. She shows up again later, and Kay takes the name Joe when he thinks he was born of a replicant. And her AI, just out in the world as an ad, calls Kay Joe again. And I think that that's interesting and almost undermining her humanity, in that it kind of gives the idea that she might call any replicant Joe if they start to feel special enough. I don't know. I think the whole thing is just really interesting. I think it's worth talking about whether she would actually be considered someone who dies or is just unmade.
Oh, did you read the ad scene? Like, that was actually, like, happening? Because I read that as, like, Joe was sort of imagining it. Like, he was sort of thinking about her, or Kay, I guess. I don't know what name you want to use, but that he was sort of imagining it and kind of projecting this onto her. And I got that feeling just because of the way that scene ends. Not just from the way she was, like, really explicitly, like, interacting with him. I mean, I guess it's the same technology, so, like, she could have. But the fact that, like, she just kind of went back to being an ad right after, like, made me question whether it was, like, something, like, he was kind of projecting, as... I guess it would make sense for, like, even the billboard to, like, interact with people.
Yeah, that's where I see where you're coming from, and, like, that's actually a really interesting take on that, because I didn't see it as that at all. But I do think that it is... her model is seen in the background of another scene, in, like, that exact style of billboard where she's a quote-unquote displayed as a pleasure model. She's naked, for what it's worth. Not touching on that one right now. But that exact model is seen twice before. One time kind of crouching and I believe interacting with someone else, and once just on a big billboard. And I think the fact that she was interacting with someone else before reinforces the idea that this ad might interact with people on a person-to-person basis. The fact that she calls him a Joe is particular because it's a pleasure model. And to people in the sex industry would refer to clientele as Joes. So for her to call him a Joe makes sense in universe as well.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense, because I definitely hadn't thought of it from that angle. When she used the name Joe, that's when I kind of got the feeling that it was maybe something, and I guess, like, it would make more sense for it to actually be happening, because the movie, well, I mean, I don't know, because the movie is already sort of playing with this idea of how reliable memories are. Like, we see, that's the whole plot sort of hinges on this memory, this moment that we think actually happened because he found the evidence of it happening, and it did happen. It just didn't happen to Kay. So it's sort of getting into the unreliability of memory. So I guess that's one of the reasons why I sort of read the scene as, like, it's not, again, something that, like, he is projecting, like, a thought that he is having, almost like a dream sequence. But I guess it works either way, like, when you think about, like, all the layers from it. That's a cool scene.
That's awesome. That's so cool. I love that.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, and I think it makes me want to, like, rewatch it and with a more careful eye on her, because Joy, because I remember liking, she was my other, like, favorite thing about the movie aside from Ryan Gosling's character, and I remember feeling a little deflated when she died, not because of like, oh, like, that was sad, like, how dare you take away one of my favorite characters, but just because like, as you said, it was telegraphed so clearly, and it wasn't even something that it was, like, weighing over me for the whole movie. It was just sort of like, oh, okay, here's a plot point. She even explicitly says, like, once I'm done, just like a human. And as soon as she says that, you know in the back of your mind, like, oh, okay, yeah, like, she's a goner.
That wasn't even in the back of my mind. That was like, oh, she's dead.
Yeah. And it's something I forgot about. Like, it wasn't something that actively, like, I was stewing on the whole movie. But so that almost made it worse for when it actually happened. It was kind of like, oh, right. Like, oh, of course. So that scene of her getting crushed is a little disappointing just because of how clearly telegraphed it was. But I think what was a more interesting moment, sort of addressing this maybe blurred line of humanity with this hologram, was when, after the mortars went off, I think, in the junkyard, we see her hologram, like, trying to, like, reach out to Kay or waking up, and she, like, glitches out. She's, like, outside the car, and, like, she looks very human, but she's, like, stuttering and, like, pixelated, and, like, her voice is going whack, and, the technology is glitching out. And, we just get a lot of reminders like that, with her, not even just from, like, I'm a hologram who can change my appearance at will, but also just, that she has, like, a loading screen that, like, whenever Kay is messing with her settings, like, the corporate logo will come up and she has to, like, reboot. We just get a lot of those, like, machine elements from her, but also a lot of very human things. And I think those elements throughout the movie, that running theme, do a much better job than, like, her actual death scene, which, again, is just sort of like, oh, okay.
It's really interesting. I don't think we're actually going to come up with an honest answer here, because it's much like the first. As I said, it's a much more ambiguous version of the first movie, where the question is, are replicants, equivalent to humans? That one's pretty clearly answered. In this one, it's much more of a B plot, and it's left much more open to interpretation, and I like that a lot. And I mean, even from our quick discussion where we went, oh shit, you saw that scene totally different, it's going to be completely a case-by-case basis.
Yep.
Which I fucking adore. I think that's absolutely incredible. I didn't realize that we saw that scene so absolutely differently. That's fucking awesome. I'm so happy about that. Like, I am genuinely grinning over here right now. That's so cool.
Yeah, that was already one of my favorite scenes, just because of, like, how kind of, like, weird and out of nowhere, and it just was, like, a really good character beat for Kay, but, like, yeah, like, it's even better now.
It's good. Her whole thing is incredible. Every scene she's in is a marvel of cinematography. It looks gorgeous. There's some really awesome stuff that they do with her. There's a whole sex scene that's a little weird if you think about it, but, like, visually is so incredibly stunning. I'm blown away. That's a scene that's going to stick with me for a long fucking time, because it is absolutely gorgeously done. It's so good. Before I just continue to gush, let's wrap this up with another conversation about Deckard. Actually, should he have died at the end of the movie is the ultimate question. Kay at the end is sent out by this underground organization of replicants to quote unquote kill Deckard. We find out that later means that he is to fake Deckard's death and make it seem like he's died in the water outside of Los Angeles. And then he gets to go meet his daughter, who we met earlier on. I don't know that I really have that much of an opinion on this part. And I think that speaks to our opening as well, just because I didn't really care if Deckard lived or died. I was way more invested in Kay. So when he lived, I kind of went, all right, whatever. We got a nice resolving scene with Kay back in front of this memory creation facility that I thought worked really, really nicely, which we wouldn't have if Deckard had died. I mean, we might have. I'm sure there's some way they could have done it. But overall, at the end of the movie, I felt the same way about Deckard that I did basically when he showed up, which was, I don't really care.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought just because of how much it plays into Kay's death. And I like Kay's death, and I like what that means for his character and how we're sort of left to he's sort of left to like ponder his humanity and his fleeting moments kind of by himself, and I like that. I like how it mirrors the Tears and Rain monologue, because it's like snow. That felt like a nice little callback in a way that wasn't like overly like sledgehammery, like there isn't a monologue from him this time.
It's a nice remembrance of his original scene outside of the same thing in the snow. Both times are when he feels his most human. It's a great scene, honestly, but I don't think Deckard does anything for it.
Yeah, because he gets his reunion with his daughter, and like that's one of the parts where I'm like, is this too schmaltzy? I don't know. I really don't, and
it did feel too happy in a way.
It did, especially because like it definitely felt very. It felt very almost like this is gonna be like maybe a weird reference, but like A Tale of Two Cities, like the guy like going off to replace the other guy at his own execution. Like, it is a far greater thing I ever do. Like, that's how it ends up sort of feeling, just because, and we know that either way, like, whether Deckard is alive or not, and you know what, I'm starting to lean toward maybe he should live, because I feel like the other thing about Kay is that his humanity comes partially from this ability to, like, maybe disobey orders, because before he'd just been kind of this tool to, like, kill other replicants, and him, like, helping Deckard meet his daughter again is another, like, moment of disobedience, where he's going against kind of this order to have him killed to, like, preserve the movement. I think it kind of is.
Because it's explicitly stated that he is to kill Deckard, and he says that he completed his mission, which in any other situation I would take it as he disobeyed orders and let Deckard live. However, this movie's all about questioning what really is, and I wonder if this wasn't his mission. He is dead to the world, so it's hard to say. I would argue that this was part of his mission. That was my read on it.
I don't know, because, like, him saying that, like, my mission is complete, like, he's dead to the world, that felt like a pretty, like, hollow justification. I feel like if Kay had the opportunity to, like, go back and tell the one-eyed lady, like, nah, it's cool, like, let him go, but, you know, don't worry, no one knows that he's alive, I feel like she would not have been, like, very happy with that answer.
Nah, it's cool. We're good.
No, because it sort of rings to me like, well, like, who knew he was alive in the first place? Like, the robot lady and Jared Leto. And, you know, the robot lady is dead, sure, and, like, the car crash. But, like, just because the car crashed in the ocean, like, doesn't mean he didn't get away. It's not like they left, like, a body on site for them to find. It felt like a pretty hollow justification to me for, like, disobeying, like, not completing his mission. It felt like something it'd be very easy to, like, poke some holes in, like, okay, well, what if they investigated the site of the crash? Or, like, what if Jared Leto had this technology that lets him know this? It felt a little half-hearted, and so I interpreted it as, like, this moment of, like, making his own decision. Maybe more so than disobeying orders. I don't think, like, sparing Deckard so he could reunite with his daughter, I don't think that was really, like, part of the plan. So I do think that was his own moment of deciding that this human moment of reuniting, like, father and daughter was more important to him than carrying out, like, the letter of this task he'd been given.
Yeah, that is fair. I don't know. I see, once again, it kind of goes back to the whole idea of, I think there are kind of two reads on this one, and I definitely see where you're coming from with this, and I don't think you're wrong. I just disagree, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It just, as I said, nothing you are saying is untrue, and nothing you are saying is by any means incorrect. It's just, I don't know. It felt kind of like that was how it was supposed to go in my watch of it. Hard to say. Basically, that's the theme of this episode, as is the theme of Blade Runner. It's hard to say. Who knows? So, with that, we are going to bring this episode to a close. I'm Sean McKinda. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. I also stream every Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday at 8 o'clock at twitch.tv/helpless_Skippy. Wednesdays we play some PUBG. Thursdays I play a roguelike with my buddy. And then Sundays we play God knows what. It depends on what we're feeling. Usually something stupid that we find on Steam for like $2.
And I'm Jackson Keller. You can find me on Twitter at JacksonJKeller. I pretty much only hang out there because I'm a grumpy old man who doesn't use the internet so much anymore. But come say hello and tell me why I'm wrong about Blade Runner and everything else.
Yeah, please. Definitely. If you have a story about someone who saw this movie without seeing the first one, tweet at us. We are BADH_cast. We would love to hear it. I'm genuinely curious how you felt about Harrison Ford in this movie. Otherwise, we would definitely like to thank Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide alternate take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. Next week, we're going to be talking about Stephen King's The Mist. This one is a divisive movie, to say the least. I will be very curious to hear what you have to say about Jackson, because you haven't seen it, right?
Nope, never seen this one. Didn't realize it was even divisive. Sean had proposed this because we're getting into spooky times. It's almost Halloween. We're in the October months. And so we're going to be doing kind of like a horror theme. I have my own little pick that we'll be talking about the week after. So no, I didn't even realize it was like super divisive. I hadn't heard much about this movie, really.
Yeah, it specifically, there's a part in it that basically turns off most people from this movie, and it's very fitting to this podcast. Let's just say that. So I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about it, and I'm really looking forward to this one. We're gonna try and do the black and white version. I've heard that's strictly better because it's a little hokey if you watched it in color. But like with black and white, it feels more natural, I guess. We'll see. Other than that, please, if you are listening to us and you like what you've heard, tell a friend, pass some word of mouth around, let other people know. Go on iTunes, leave us a rating, a review. Just, that type of stuff. It seriously helps us out. We're still growing. Any little bit helps. Thank you is all I can really say. We did recently hit a pretty big milestone. We've had a bunch of people downloading it. We've had a pretty solid fan base growing. And thank you guys for tuning in every week or whenever you happen to know the movie. It means a lot to us. I absolutely love doing this. It's genuinely enjoyable to me, so it means a whole lot.
It's more fun than a barrel of monkeys, and that's a pithy way of me saying yes, also thank you. The response has been wonderful.
Until then, though,
it's time to run some blades.
Don't run with scissors.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go